I'm going to talk a little bit about freedom, and in particular about why we think that freedom is so important, and why we think that freedom is so valuable. So if we think about it, our attachment to freedom really frames how we think about pretty much all of the political issues that we talk about. So how we talk about the role of government, how we talk about our interactions with one another, how we talk about the allocation of resources in our society. But when we try to define freedom or to explain what it means to be free and why that freedom is valuable, it turns out that answering the question is more difficult than it might sound. So what I'm going to do today is focus on a distinction that's really quite common to make, which is the distinction between negative freedom and what we might call positive freedom. So negative freedom is usually construed as being able to do what you want without anyone interfering with you or obstructing you in what you want to do. Whereas positive freedom has something to do with being in control of your own life in a deeper way, like having goals and desires which are truly your own in some kind of deep sense, and I'll talk a little bit about what that might mean. Now, this distinction's been around for a long time, I think as far back as the 18th century, but was really made popular by a guy named Isaiah Berlin in an essay he wrote in 1969 called Two Concepts of Liberty. So my plan is to talk a little bit more about this distinction between negative and positive freedom, and in particular about how these two conceptions of freedom seem to indicate very different things about the role of government if we think that one thing, or maybe the primary thing that a government is supposed to do, is to protect and promote the freedom of its citizens. And in talking about negative freedom, I'll talk a little bit about why we might think that negative freedom alone doesn't tell the whole story about what freedom is and what's important about freedom. In talking about positive freedom, I'll also talk a little bit about why we might think that the positive conception of freedom is problematic in terms of what it might license the state to do if we want to form our government around the promotion of positive freedom. And then after that, I'm going to introduce a third notion of freedom, which is the notion of freedom as non-domination. This conception of freedom is intended to be an alternative to the negative and the positive conceptions. And what I'll do is I'll say a little bit about why some people think that this kind of freedom, also sometimes called Republican freedom, it gives a better account of what it is about freedom, which is relevant to our relationships with other people, and which is therefore a more appropriate benchmark for the use in the design and assessment of government institutions, and maybe also social institutions. Okay. So, negative freedom. The idea of negative freedom is probably the idea of freedom with which most people are the most familiar with. So very broadly, the idea is that I am free to the extent that I can do whatever I want without anyone or anything interfering with or obstructing me. Put another way, the less that's standing in the way of my doing what I want to do in a given situation, the more free I can be said to be. Now, the idea of promoting or protecting negative freedom is one of the driving forces behind what we think of as political liberalism, or the liberal state. That it doesn't matter what your desires are or what your values are that you want to shape your life around, the liberal state shouldn't interfere or won't interfere with your pursuit of those goals and values, and it won't dictate to you what those goals and values should be. So the idea here is that negative freedom is a really hands-off conception of freedom. It's really about being left alone and not being interfered with. And many people even think that this negative conception of freedom is the foundation of what government is there to do and to protect. Government's primary duty is to keep us from being interfered with by other people. But note the tension there, right? On this view, if we think about what government does, government itself is importantly freedom limiting, because every coercive imposition of a law is an interference with my ability to do something, right? So if the state says, if you drive on the left side of the road, I'm going to punish you, the state is interfering with my freedom to drive on the left side of the road. So this conception of freedom as a negative conception, put together with justification for the state, really gives us sort of an uncomfortable marriage, right? Typically, what we would say is that the reason the government is justified in imposing limits to our actions on this kind of view is that without some kind of limit to what we can each do, without some kind of interference, then it turns out that none of us will ever actually be able to do anything at all, right? So if there's no limitation to anything that I do, then I'm just going to be in your way all the time. So on this view of negative freedom, the problem for the state is to find a way to constrain people's actions so that they can live together, but to maintain as much negative freedom as possible, with keeping in mind that any imposition of any kind of rule by the state is in fact a violation of negative freedom in and of itself. So there's a question here, is this enough? Negative freedom is a really appealing ideal, At first glance, the idea that being free is synonymous with being left alone is really a rather compelling one. But there are some important limitations to how well negative freedom accords with our understanding of what it means to be free, and also about what we value in being free. So one problem for negative freedom is that since it describes freedom as not having your ability to pursue the things you value or to live the kind of life that you want being interfered with, it suggests that a person can actually be free in more than one way. So one way that I can be free is I can be left alone, and I can be accorded as much space as possible within which to choose how to do and how to live. But the other way is to simply have a more limited set of desires, because the less things that I go out and try to do, the less chances there are for things and people to interfere with me. So an example, suppose I grew up in a society in which women generally stay at home and perform domestic duties. They don't tend to be educated, and they're expected to raise the kids, keep the home, and in general ensure that their husbands are satisfied. Now suppose I go through my whole life being told that this is what it means to be a woman, and that these are the things that I'm supposed to want and to value and to enjoy. And moreover, suppose that I accept all of those things to be true, that a woman's role is to keep the home and raise the kids, that I don't need a fancy education because what would I do with it anyway, and that I can lead a perfectly happy and content life catering to the needs of my husband. Now, as long as no one is forcing me, right, as long as there's no one standing at that door saying, you can't leave and go out and have a different life, or I'm going to fill in bad thing here, it seems like according to the notion of freedom that I spelled out, the negative conception of freedom, I have to be called free, because no one is preventing me from doing what it is that I want to do. What I want to do, in fact, is precisely what I am doing, right? I'm staying home, taking care of the kids, helping my husband. Okay, so one concern that some might have with this negative conception of freedom, then, is that it simply seems to imply that in this example I would be free. And moreover, that in a more general sense, I can make myself more free simply by changing my desires to fit the conditions that I find myself in, reducing the number or kinds of things that I value. So the fewer things that I want to do, the more demanding my conception of value is, or my view of the good life, the easier it will be for my life to be a free one, because there will be less things for people to interfere with. Now, if I have desires or preferences, the fulfillment of which would encounter interference from others, my freedom could be increased by the removal of that interfering thing, right? Or it could just as easily be increased by my revising my preferences in order to accommodate a more limited set of possibilities. But this seems counterintuitive, right? We don't want our conception of freedom to say that one way to be more free is to condition ourselves to want less, or to be satisfied with a more limited or seemingly even oppressive set of possibilities or choices in life. Another way to think about this is that the negative conception of freedom is too broad. It seems to suggest that some people are free who we might want to call unfree. So the subservient woman, for example, but think also about a nicotine addict. No matter how badly she wants to kick the habit, she can't. Every morning she wakes up and she says, I'm not going to smoke any cigarettes today, right? I'm going to go the whole day, I'm not going to do it. But try as she might, every day, by the end of the day, she has a cigarette, right? She just can't seem to get herself not to have that nicotine fix. Now, there's no person or thing interfering with this addict's ability to do as she wants, right? There's no one standing in her way, there's no one coercing her, there's no one manipulating her. But the addict is still compelled to act in certain ways which might make us want to say that she's not really free. Because no matter how badly she wants to, she really can't do otherwise than to feed her addiction. But here too, the conception of negative freedom doesn't seem to give us the ability to say what it is about the addict that makes her unfree. So it might be that the negative conception of freedom just doesn't give us the whole story about what it means to be free. So, positive freedom. The conception of positive freedom is something more substantive than negative freedom. It demands that I be in control of my own life in a really deep way, and in particular, that I be in control of the desires and values around which I structure my life. So the desires and the choices that I make, they have to be my own. And simply being left to my own devices isn't enough to make my decisions be my own. So this means that I have to in some way identify with those desires, and that I can't increase my freedom just by reducing my desires or revising my preferences in order to accord with a potentially oppressive situation. Rather, my desires are supposed to originate within me, right? So it's me guiding my desires and not my circumstances. And one of the things that we think about when we think about positive freedom is the idea that my desires, my preferences, my values, my goals, these should be a reflection of what we might call my true self, right? So truly mine in a really deep way. Now, this condition of positive freedom is often characterized in terms of a person's mental state or their psychological status. The addict that we talked about before is not free, not because of something external to her that is hindering her ability to do as she chooses, but because her actions don't reflect her true preferences, the desire to give up her addiction and live a smoke-free life. Now, in this case, we might distinguish between the addict's basic desires, such as the desire for a cigarette, right, that desire that's operating on her that moment when she breaks down and goes outside and lights one up, and what we might call her higher order desires, or her desires about her desires. So remember that the addict wants to quit smoking. She wakes up every morning determined, today I'm going to stop. Today I'm not going to do this. This means that her higher order desire is to not desire to smoke. True freedom in this case, then, according to the positive conception, would involve her being able to act in accordance with her true self as expressed in terms of those higher order desires, or those desires about what she wants to want. Okay. This kind of freedom is better able to account for people who seem to have the kind of negative freedom discussed previously, but who we nevertheless want to say aren't entirely free, like the addict, right? But specifying what constitutes a person's true self can be more difficult, making this conception of freedom a lot harder to explain than the negative conception. So on this view of freedom, we need to be able to say what it means to have desires of one's own, as opposed to desires which have been influenced in pernicious ways that might compromise a person's freedom. And moreover, we need to be able to say what it means to have desires of one's own. I just said that, sorry. So this is often unpacked in the way that I've already mentioned, right? By making reference to a person's desires and preferences and whether they're first order or second order desires. But we might think that this isn't enough, that desires and preferences must also be formed in a way which is independent of certain kinds of noxious influences. So think again about the subservient woman. We might imagine that her higher order preferences are consistent with her desires that she has to be a good wife and to take care of her kids, right? When she thinks about it, she thinks, yeah, no, this is really the life that I want. I want to be a good wife. I want to be a good mother and to be committed to my family and to put this above all of my other values. And this isn't because anyone's actively interfering with her, and it's not because she doesn't identify with her preferences, but we nevertheless want to say that she's unfree. And the reason we want to say that she's unfree is because we think that her preferences came about as a result of a process that is somehow pernicious, right? Maybe we think that she has been socialized in a way which has deprived her of the ability to figure out what she really wants, what she most values. Perhaps we think that society has inculcated her with its own values and never provided her with the opportunity to form goals and desires which are really her own in some kind of deep way. So I hope that by now it should be obvious why this is a much more demanding conception of freedom to both to meet but also to explain. Because it's really difficult to unpack whether and to what extent a person's desires and preferences are really a reflection of her true self. So with the subservient woman, we say, well, look, maybe society has inculcated her with these desires and they're not really hers because we have this sort of preconceived notion of what it is that she would want if she was in a different social position, right? But now think about my decision to become a philosopher. Probably that decision was largely informed by the fact that my mother raised me to love books, by the fact that I had good teachers growing up who encouraged me to think deeply about hard questions, by my love of mathematics, right? But those are all ways that society and the social structures in which I've been raised have also influenced my desires. So how do we pick apart what makes the subservient woman unfree and me free? How do we decide what it is that makes certain influences pernicious and other influences not? So these are all difficult questions that the defender of positive freedom has to answer. More than that, the defender of positive freedom has to contend with the following problem. Positive freedom, conceived of as control over our own lives, seems to present a new problem for the justification of political authority, since living under the state seems to limit the extent to which we are each able to direct our own lives in accordance with the values and desires of our true selves. Now, one way of trying to rectify this problem, to rectify the notion of positive freedom with political authority, is to suggest that positive freedom is achieved precisely by our participation in democratic political decision-making. So on this account, democracy as a form of rule is considered the embodiment of positive freedom because it leaves it in the hands of society to determine how it will be organized. Okay. But is this too much? We might be worried about describing the state's role as one of promoting our positive freedom. In particular, we might be concerned about the idea that the state is the proper instrument for ensuring that individuals' positive freedom is maximized. So go back to the subservient woman. We might think about why it is that we don't think she has positive freedom. We might think that she doesn't understand what it is that's in her interests. We might think that her beliefs about what her desires really are in some way mistaken. Maybe we think that if she had just had more information, or if only she was more rational, she would change her mind and value something different. Or that if only we could make her understand that she could be independent, that there's some other form of valuable life out there, she would want and value the kinds of things that we think she ought to want and value to be free. But there's a concern here, which is that now I seem to be imputing to this woman values and judgments that she doesn't have. And I also seem to be opening the door, if I want to structure my society on the basis of promoting this kind of positive freedom, to making those decisions for me, right? To society saying, oh, well, you don't value those things? You know, you really would if you were more rational, or if you thought this through more, or if you had more information. And if the impetus behind certain state institutions is this kind of promotion of positive freedom, which is really open to interpretation, then we seem to be opening the door to a kind of paternalistic tyranny, right? The imposition of rules and norms that we don't agree with, but which are imposed upon us really for our own good. So there are any number of directions from which we might criticize the negative and positive conceptions of freedom, and I've really just sketched a few of them. But I want to use the remaining time to introduce, or at least to gesture at, what I think is a potential third way to think about freedom. And this way is often referred to as Republican freedom, or as I called it earlier, freedom as non-domination. This conception is closely tied in contemporary political thought to the works of Quentin Skinner and Philip Pettit. Now, this notion of freedom as non-domination may best be understood in terms of how it is different from both positive and negative conceptions. The negative conception is about non-interference. In this way, it suggests that freedom is about the absence of something. The positive conception of freedom is about the presence of a certain thing, control over oneself, or the ability to master the passions with the intellect, maybe, the subjection of first-order desires or baser desires to higher-order ones, or some kind of self-rule cashed out in terms of democratic decision-making. But in each of these cases, the suggestion is that freedom is about control or mastery, and in particular, about who or what is the master of or in control of a person's values, desires, and actions. The Republican conception of freedom as non-domination tries to cut across this distinction and describes freedom as about the absence of something, but not about the absence of interference. Rather, freedom is about the absence of mastery by other people. What it means to be free on this account is not to be subject to the arbitrary whim or caprice of other parties. Or another way to think about this is that freedom is about not being dependent on the goodwill of others, nor subject to their capricious interference. Now note that negative freedom, freedom as non-interference, is actually compatible with quite a significant level of domination. A person can be completely left alone and free to do as she pleases, but nevertheless in a position of great vulnerability to the arbitrary whims of another. So again, think about the subservient woman. As I've described her case, she's completely free in terms of the negative conception of freedom. No one and nothing is interfering with her ability to pursue her interests. But we nevertheless thought that she was unfree in an important sense, that given her membership in this particularly oppressive society, and given her lack of opportunity to support herself outside of her home, even if her husband is a generally very kind man who treats her very well, she's nevertheless in a position in which he could interfere with her in any case in which he was so inclined. So even without exercising the power to interfere with this woman's ability to go out and do what she might truly value, it is a power that he has. He can subjugate her interests to his own interests. Moreover, freedom as non-domination is able to explain how a person can be free while nevertheless being interfered with. So consider what I said earlier, that all coercive interference or imposition of state power is a form of interference, and consequently a restriction of what I've called negative freedom. But not all state power has to be dominating. Interference which is non-arbitrary and responsive to the interests of citizens, such as the rule of law, is not only compatible with freedom, but actually a necessary prerequisite for freedom of a meaningful sort. Since absent some dependable legal framework which protects us from others, we can never be assured that we will be able to pursue our interests. So what makes the conception of freedom as non-domination particularly attractive for use in thinking about political institutions is that it is specifically a notion that is used to describe relationships rather than individuals. That is, it allows us to talk about the structural features which govern individual and institutional relationships rather than looking for some feature or features of an individual via which to call her free or not free. So it might be the case that we hold on to the positive conception of freedom, and we think that in order to be truly free, a person has to have all of these positive things going on. But when we're talking about the design or assessment of state institutions, what we're really interested in is the ability to assess the power relations which are established by different policies and institutions. So what I've said so far is pretty sketchy. Tomorrow in my research talk, what I'm going to do is try to give a much more filled out conception of what non-domination is, and talk a little bit about how we can use it to inform our thinking about policy in one particular arena. That's it.